All right, this is a module on understanding the nervous system. So this is what we're going to talk about, what you're going to master in this section. We're going to talk about both the peripheral nervous system, which is everything that you see there in the yellow, and the central nervous system, which is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. So the peripheral nervous system is everything outside the brain and the spinal cord. The example we're going to use throughout this module is if you burn your hand. So you touch something hot with your right hand. The question is, how does that information get into your nervous system? How do you know about it? How do you pull your hand away? What enables you to do these things? So when you're talking about the nervous system, you need some ideas of there's different terminology that we use to describe the location of things. So medial would be straight in the midline, right? In the middle of the body, that would be medial, and anything on the outside of that, that would be considered lateral. There's also, if something's on the opposite side of the body, it's called contralateral. If it's on the same side, it's ipsilateral. And two other terms that we're going to talk about are afferent with an A, that's sensory information going to the brain, and efferent is motor information coming out to your muscles. Additionally, okay, so if we're looking at the peripheral nervous system, you touch something hot with your receptors on your hand, and that information is transmitted via dendrites to the cell body located here, and then the information then is carried along the axon, and it makes its first stop in the spinal cord. This is a section of the spinal cord here, as if you were cut in half. So in that butterfly region in the center, that's called the gray matter, and there's one synapse that's made with a neuron, another synapse that's made to the motor neuron, and then here's the flow of information to the muscle. Okay, so this is called the reflex arc, and when we're talking about the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, that's part of the peripheral nervous system. That interneuron there is part of the central nervous system. This is an example of something that's ipsilateral. You see that all of this is happening on the same side of the body. And we're talking here, this is the somatic nervous system. Okay, this is something that you're consciously aware of. So there's a somatic nervous system, and then there's also the autonomic nervous system as part of the peripheral nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is branched into both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. Now, you may have heard about the sympathetic nervous system. It's also known as the fight or flight response. So if you get afraid or frightened, certain things happen to your body. Your pupils dilate, your salivary glands, your mouth might dry up, your palms get sweaty. So these are things that enable the body to prepare to fight or flight. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, is more of this rest and digest. It's kind of when you're relaxed and just in normal state, your parasympathetic nervous system is dominant. But these two are really in a balance, your PNS, or your autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic and sympathetic. Information is carried, as we saw here, for this reflex arc by sensory neurons and motor neurons. But then there are also not only this one interneuron we see here, but multiple interneurons that are carrying that information up to the central nervous system, which we're going to talk about next. But I also wanted to point out that, when you burn your hand like this, you will also have a sympathetic nervous system response too, because the sympathetic nervous system is going to know, do you need to run away, or do you, what can you do? Your heart rate's up. Your body has been activated because of this pain. Okay, so the information, it reaches the spinal cord here, and it makes this reflex arc synapse. It's going to synapse with another neuron as well, and then start to send that information up to the brain. And that would be an ascending pathway when information is coming into the spinal cord and then up to the brain. it's also, as it makes its way up to the brain, it's going to give a contralateral projection. The brain actually has two hemispheres. They're not identical, but two sides to the brain. And information from the right hand is going to ultimately make it to the left hemisphere of the brain. And ultimately, where it ends up in the brain is in the outer layer of the brain. It's about 3 millimeters thick. It's called cortex, which literally means the outer covering, like the bark. And the sensory information is projected to the parietal lobe. That receives somatosensory information about touch, temperature, and also pain of your body. The occipital lobe back here, this green area back here, is important for vision. The temporal lobe near your temple is important for audition. And the frontal lobe, there's a strip in the frontal lobe that executes your motor movements. Now, that's just part of what the lobes are doing. A bigger chunk, so for parietal lobe, the rest of it, instead of just receiving body information, is also important for spatial information processing. The temporal lobe is also important for language processing, and you'll see memory and attention, or memory and emotion as well. And the frontal lobe is responsible for executive functions. Now, even before the information makes it to that outer cortex of the brain, it typically stops along the way at the thalamus. So the thalamus is considered a subcortical structure. It's also known as the sensory relay station, because sensory information comes up through the spinal cord. It makes a synapse in the thalamus, and from the thalamus it goes to the appropriate lobe. If it's visual information, it goes to the occipital lobe. In this example, it's pain information, and that's going to somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. There are other structures located underneath the cortex here that are important. The hippocampus is within the temporal lobe. It's subcortical in the temporal lobe, and it's responsible for memory, laying down memories. The amygdala for emotion. So these are things that are also going to be activated with this painful stimulus, so that you can remember in the future. It elicits an emotional response. You can remember in the future, don't touch a hot pot. To reconnect then, we were introduced in this module to the nervous system, which is comprised of the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. The somatic nervous system, shown here, especially for the reflex arc, the information is picked up at the sensory receptors, transmitted to the spinal cord, where it communicates with an interneuron. The interneuron communicates with a motor neuron, which causes the muscles to move and then pull the hand away. And in addition to activating the somatic nervous system, which we saw in this slide right here, the autonomic nervous system is also activated with this sensory information coming in. So the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, which are typically in balance, are going to be out of balance when you have a painful stimulus, in that the sympathetic nervous system will be activated. So the information then is going from the peripheral nervous system, now traveling up the spinal cord in the central nervous system. It had switched over to that contralateral side, and its first stop will be in the thalamus, where from there it'll be relayed to somatosensory cortex, which is in the outer covering of the brain. And then, projected from the thalamus, the information will go to the parietal lobe, particularly that somatosensory strip of the parietal lobe, and that begins then the processing in cortex for this information. But it doesn't stay in that somatosensory strip. It's transferred all throughout the brain, and further and to engage in further motor behaviors as well. So there's your review of the nervous system. Hopefully this was helpful. In this module, you'll find additional information about other videos that you can watch, refreshers on terminology, etc.